Okay, so welcome everybody. Today is February 25th, and it's our Sunday Dharma group, and I'm happy to see all of you after being away last weekend. So just to go over a few of our guidelines for the meeting is no crosstalk, meaning that during the question and answer period, it's to really allow for spaces between someone asking a question and the response before you ask your question. So we have a tendency to kind of, somebody says something and then the mind gets triggered by a thought, and then our next reaction is to just say whatever it is that comes to mind without really thinking it through, or even not even so much thinking it through, but really seeing what's happening in the body as you're listening to whatever's being said. So this is very much a practice of embodiment, meaning that we're not just connected to our minds, because that's, or our thinking mind, to be more clear, because that's something that we sometimes rely on to get us through life. Like our thoughts, we place a lot of values on our thoughts and a lot of energy into thinking, and we leave out the heart and we leave out the body. So, and when we're caught up in the mind, that also is very much tied to our defense system. So whenever we have thoughts that are upsetting, then our defenses get triggered, and then whatever we say comes out of that energy, that reactive energy. There isn't a whole lot of wisdom there. That energy is one of pushing away or grasping and clinging to. So we really want to call in the power of the body and the power of the heart to help us stay connected as we first respond to what's going on here. And then if there's, from that place, you want to say something, then it comes out from a much more embodied place and a place of the heart, rather than just your concepts and ideas about how things should be. Does that make sense? Yeah. And even listening to a Dharma talk is a practice, meaning that our tendency is to listen not with a kind of beginner's mind, but sometimes we listen with an expert's mind. So we're evaluating what's being said versus what we know, and then discounting whatever doesn't fit in my worldview, gets tossed out. So there's no opportunity for whatever is being said to land. And it's not that you have to believe it, because I would be, not me, but even the Buddha was the first one to say, don't believe everything that you hear, actually practice and see for yourself. And that's the beauty of this practice, that you're invited to actually have a lived experience of whatever it is, So for example, it's really opening to our experience instead of what we normally do, which is if we like it, then we'll open to it. If we don't like it, the mind gets tight, it gets closed, our body gets tight, contracted, and we kind of get caught in that narrow worldview of things are happening that shouldn't be happening. And, we can spend a lot of time and a lot of energy kind of feeding on that, which in no way helps. So, and at the same time, I want to say that's normal. So I'm not making it wrong that we go there, but we need to also, this is part of the practice, to open to it, and then to try and see what is the wise action when it comes to what's happening within me right now, rather than staying and feeding whatever story I have in my head. Can I bring calm to the emotions if that's what's needed, right? Particularly, and so I want to frame this um, around the events that have been happening these past few weeks that um, can trigger us and can trigger all kinds of reactions. I'm talking about the Parkland event. So it's kind of like a call for sanity, because otherwise we go off on tangents, um, and I say that sometimes we abandon ourselves because we kind of get caught up in all the emotions, and it can cause the heart to contract and our minds to contract. So, so as I was saying, as you listen to the Dharma talk, it's just to notice what you're feeling as you're listening. What do you feel in your body, and where you're placing your attention, and where the mind goes once you notice, um, like if there's anxiety, what are your thoughts like? Um, it's keeping that open mind and being present, taking in the words, letting them land, and it's a contemplative practice, which means that it's investigative, it's reflective, and and it gives us more access to the heart and more access to the body. So one of the places that we center our attention to really bring ourselves into the present moment is the breath, right? And that's with us everywhere we go. So that's a wonderful resource that we can use to begin to ground ourselves in the present when our mind has gone off into thoughts or wandering off into the past or the future, that we call on the breath and it brings us directly into contact with our body. But the mind then will wander off again and again. So the practices bring it back, over and over again. And how you do that is really important. So you want to do it with gentleness, with kindness, and friendliness. So the guidelines are to listen in that embodied way, really being present. You might even notice how the breath changes as you're listening. That's a way to see when something's gotten triggered, or to notice where your attention goes when, something's said that triggers maybe a reaction of some sort, whether it's a pleasant reaction, unpleasant, or kind of neutral. And it's also that this isn't therapy. So I want to make that really clear. This is not a therapy group. So we're not here to try to fix each other. We're just here to share this practice. Because one thing that all of us have in common is our ability to have joy, our ability to have suffering. And so in this practice, we're really trying to learn how to be with suffering in a way that leads to liberating ourselves from it. And so one way is to remember that, that our common humanity, that all of us in some way suffer, and that's part of being part of the human experience. And by the same token, that we all have the capacity to meet those challenges or to meet life with compassion, with this open heart. That's why we practice. It's to build the capacity of the heart to stay open, of the mind to stay open. So even when you're listening to a Dharma talk, you're cultivating that capacity to remain open-minded, to notice what's happening, not make yourself wrong when the mind wanders or when you get contracted or when fear comes up, but more than anything to begin to explore that, like what happens in my body when fear is present, what happens to my breath. And that's where the liberation comes, right? Because nothing shifts unless you're actually aware of what's happening. So think those are all the guidelines that I want to. Also, one last thing is to be aware of, if you're asking a question, that we kind of allow for everyone to have an opportunity. Sometimes there's lots of questions, sometimes there's no questions, but it's kind of being really cognizant of the other people in the room. So I think that's about it. So with that, there were two things that I was going to come in and that I was debating within my mind, or reflecting on which one would be of most benefit. And of course, I'm not going to know the complete answer to that, but so I decided that maybe I'll share a little bit of both. Because I went away on retreat and I wanted to share my experience with that, with you, because it was all about being immersed in the practice. And I think it's helpful to share whatever I learned from going away on that retreat. So it was an 8-day retreat that I went on, and it was on wise concentration, which I believe is the last step on the Eightfold Path, the Noble Eightfold Path. The Noble Eightfold Path is the path that the Buddha identified as the path to liberation and freedom from suffering. So this was all about developing concentration through the practice of meditation. And so the whole day consisted of periods of sitting meditation, periods of walking meditation, and then we were in silence for the whole 8 days. And it went from 5:30 in the morning when we would wake up, and from 6 o'clock we would go to meditate for 30 minutes, and then at 6:30 we would have breakfast, and then 7:15 would start. Everybody had a yogi job, so all of us had a job that we had to do while we were there, and that's part of the practice that you do that. Even your yogi job, that you do it very mindfully, like what you were talking about, James, to be really present and to put your attention on whatever it is that you're doing, and to notice when your mind wanders off, come back. So, and then after that was coming back for a Dharma talk at 8:15, which was probably about 45 minutes. And that was followed by periods of sitting, 45 minutes walking, sometimes 30, sometimes 45 minutes. And then lunchtime, and then more sitting, walking, and metta practice or loving kindness practice, and dinner, and then more sitting and walking. So this is a long day. It started at 5:30, it ended at 9:15 at night. So it was very, very intensive practice. It took me probably, I want to say, about 3 days for the mind to calm. Because right before that, you're going from doing a lot of busy, work to get to the retreat center, and then you get there and there's nothing to do. So it was interesting to watch that transition of coming in with that kind of energy, and then what the mind would do. So some of the things that I experienced was noticing how the mind is so judgmental. Like I was judging. It was just like my mind was judging, labeling people, experiences. So it was quite a practice, and it was very interesting to watch that, rather than getting frustrated or actually being kind of being identified with whatever I think, because a lot of times we're identified with our thoughts. And so what I mean by that is that if we have a thought about somebody, then we label ourselves like, how can I have those thoughts? I must be a mean person, or if you have a good thought about somebody, oh, I'm a good person. And so sometimes we go through life with that, um, with those kinds of thoughts or beliefs. And this was actually liberating, because I didn't have to identify with, if I had this thought, it's just what the mind does. And when you get it, when you get that, you're not in charge of whatever thoughts you have, that thoughts just happen. That's our way of making our way in the world and making sense of the world. It brings with it freedom. You don't have to invest all your energy in your thoughts. Does that make sense? Yeah. Because that's a source of our suffering. A great source of our suffering are our thoughts. And if a way to test that out is to think about a time when you were reactive, and just examine what thoughts you had when you were reactive. What was your belief when that happened? And you'll see that there's some way in which you're relating to the world as if it shouldn't be that way, or it should be a different way. So that then triggers an emotional response and stories, and pretty soon we're stuck in our heads, in our concepts or our ideas about the way life should be. So instead of living life, we're fighting against it, resisting it, or trying to in some way manipulate or control what's happening. And that's the suffering, right? So you don't have to, it's not that you have to like what's happening, but the moment you get stuck in resisting it, then you're not being with whatever it is that's in need of attention. So if there's even if there's anger that comes up, how can you meet that in a way that's wise? If there's joy that comes up, how can you be open to that? Whatever it is that arises, how can we be present to that, feeling it in our body, and responding to it in a wise way? Because most of our tendency is kind of knee-jerk reaction, especially when there's anger. So this practice of going away on intensive retreat is a practice to watch all of that, to watch the different moods, the different thoughts, and to learn to be with them, to open and investigate. What does anger feel like? What does frustration feel like? What does joy feel like? And not to cling to one state, because joy, is pleasant, right? And so there can be this kind of wanting to keep that there. And if that were to happen, if that did happen, I could notice that, and I could notice the suffering in trying to make something stay when it was time for that to pass. So, so that was something that's the deepening of practice. Like when you go away on retreat, this is the benefit of it. That you don't have phone, you don't have any of your devices, so you get to just sit with the mind. And that's why I said it's very challenging. One of the teachers there said it's the mind is like it's like a wild horse. The untrained mind is like a wild horse or a puppy, And so the practice is that practice of bringing your focus gently back to the breath is the practice of training the mind, or training the puppy. Because there's no wisdom if you wander off. You can get into a lot of trouble. The wisdom lies in coming back and being present. And so for the practice of wise concentration, they had us focusing on the tip of the nostrils while we were doing breath meditation, which if you know, when you breathe in and you breathe out, it's not a strong sensation. Like it's much stronger if you were to place your hand on your chest and breathe in, you feel it, or your belly. But the spot right under the nose is not very subtle. It's a very subtle sensation. And the reason that it's what the Buddha taught, breath meditation at the Anapanasati spot. So, and the reason that he placed a focus there is because you have to really bring all of your focus and all of your attention to really be able to stay at that spot. So it was, that was really challenging because you're sitting for 30 minutes just paying attention to the breath at that spot. Sometimes with guidance, a lot of times without it. So the mind leaves many times, and and you're encouraged to gently bring the attention back to that spot. And the more that you do that, the more that it's kind of like clearing the window that you start to, the more that you're training that attention to come back, the clearer the window begins to come. And what I mean by that is not as many thoughts, or being able to see when the mind goes off on a tangent or in a story. And it doesn't matter when, at what point you recognize that you've gone away. That's the moment of waking up. That's the moment that you're back here. So, so that was it was a really intense practice, and many different moods, many different mind states, and a real opportunity to deepen practice. So when I came back and I started, it's not something that I share with a lot of people because if you haven't done the practice, then kind of hard to explain, what this is like. But when I shared it, I said it was very challenging, and it's something that I would do again. Because that's the way that wisdom that you grow, you cultivate that wisdom and you cultivate compassion. So every day we do metta practice or loving kindness practice. How many people are familiar with loving kindness practice? Okay. So loving kindness practice is a practice of meditation where you're using phrases of well-being or of loving kindness to really open the heart or begin to cultivate compassion. For ourselves, we start with ourselves, a benefactor, and then the circle starts to open. And eventually it's being able to have compassion for all beings. So, because this whole practice is one of purifying the mind and purifying the heart. And the only way you can do that is by really bringing your attention to what's happening in the mind and what's happening in the heart, and how when we get caught up in reactivity or in kind of unwholesome behavior or a closing of the heart, how can we bring something into the space that helps the heart to begin to open to life and not get caught up in defensive, kind of walling off or reactivity. And so reacting in ways that are hurtful towards ourselves and towards others. I mean, I don't think I have to say, like, if you flip through the news, it's very easy to see that there is a tremendous amount of suffering out there. And it's even a practice of watching what happens here as you look at that news, the reactions that that happen as you read the news. So, so those are some of the things that there's a lot that I learned in the retreat. And it's also knowing that when you come back from retreat, it's not like a one-time experience. Oh, I learned something, I come back and I could share with you everything that I learned. It's kind of something that transforms you slowly. So we use the practice to continue that, to continue keeping the heart and the mind moving. So that was some of what I wanted to share about the retreat, all of you. And during this Dharma talk, towards the end, we will do a meditation. But I also wanted to talk about, I wanted to address what happened in Parkland, because it was something that was, as a therapist and as a person, as a mother, as society, it has an effect on all of us. So I wrote a little bit about what I wanted to share. So it's been a challenging week for many, and for those who've lost loved ones, challenging doesn't even come close. I can't imagine the heartbreak these parents, teachers, students, siblings are going through as they confront going back to school after this horrific tragedy. It's touched so many people's lives, even those of us who didn't know someone to whom this happened directly. We perhaps know someone who knew a child or teacher who was killed, or perhaps knew the perpetrator who committed the crime. So, how to talk about this in a way that doesn't incite more anger or turn this into a debate becomes so important because of the fact that it's something that affects all of us. I think we can each picture ourselves in one of these persons' shoes. And the question then becomes, in this setting, how do we turn to the practice as a safe refuge? And first, it's important to say that being angry is understandable, and what some of us feel might be beyond words. The loss, sorrow, grief, and confusion is huge. So I think an appropriate place to start is with anger and the helplessness that can come up when we're faced with these kinds of tragedies. Again, we aren't here to debate the gun laws or any of those issues. We are here to learn to turn to this practice as a way of connecting with what heals and helps us to help ourselves, and in turn, to help others. So this is a quote from Thich Nhat Hanh. When we feel that we have been in some way wronged, abused, when people have treated us with violence, anger, hatred, discrimination, then a block of suffering is within us. That negative energy is in us. And if you don't know how to handle and transform the violence within us, then that violence will destroy us and the people we love. So, does that make sense? Yeah. And another story from Mahatma Gandhi on transforming anger. Mahatma Gandhi provides a perfect example of how anger can be harnessed. As a young, unknown, brown-skinned lawyer traveling in South Africa on business, he was roughly thrown from the train because he refused to surrender his first-class ticket and moved to the third-class compartment. He spent a cold, sleepless night on the railway platform. Later, he said this was the turning point of his life, for on that night, full of anger because of this personal injustice, as well as the countless injustices suffered by so many others every day in South Africa, he resolved not to rest until he had set those injustices right. On that night, he conquered his anger and vowed to resist injustice, not by violence or retaliation, but through the loving power of nonviolent resistance, which elevates the consciousness of both oppressed and oppressor. We may never be called on to liberate a people or lead a vast nation, but Gandhi's example can apply in a small way in our own lives when we decide to return goodwill for ill will, love for hatred, and in the innumerable little acts of daily life. I have learned through bitter experience the one supreme lesson to conserve my anger, and as heat conserved is transmuted into energy, even so our anger controlled can be transmuted into a power that can move the world. So anger is energy that needs to flow through us. And it's also important to know that the righteousness we feel when anger arises, kind of like I have the right to be angry, we get identified with it, is attached to the anger and defense system that keeps us alive, but sometimes blocks us from seeing through the eyes of equanimity and compassion. Anger leads to division, an us versus them, good versus evil mentality. And the truth is that we all have the capacity to be both at different times. We're made of darkness and light. We are not perfect. No one is. We feel. If cut, we bleed. If hurt, we cry or lash out. It's part of our defense system. But in doing so and in remaining attached to anger, the heart slowly hardens. The world becomes a dangerous place where an I needs to be protected from other. Who is other? You are. I am. We are. We all share in our capacity to suffer, and we all share in our capacity to respond with understanding, patience, love, and compassion. So, how does this apply to this practice of mindfulness? So, maybe talking a bit about impermanence, that nothing is solid, everything arises and falls away. One way to look at this is the body. The body is made of the earth and eventually ages and returns to the earth. But the consciousness doesn't age, doesn't have a self. It's just loving awareness. The part that witnesses without judgment and the part that can respond to what's happening. So we shift from content, meaning that's the surface, right? That's the tip of the iceberg that we take in to our senses, what we see, smell, hear, taste, touch, think. And we can stay there on the content about how wrong things are, right? and our body gets contracted, our heart gets hard. We become what's called a small self. Ego's in control. Right? And so the shift is from that content, because that's where we start. We can actually use that by beginning to notice what's happening there. And by doing that, we can then drop down into what is process or presence. What's happening right now? What am I feeling in my body? Can I open to that? Rather than going into the thoughts about how terrible it is and then feeding that energy, can I be with what's here? So the process to being that awareness, and as that happens, the grip on right, wrong beliefs and stories soften. Not right away. Because I think in our society, we want things to, that bad feeling, we want change to happen like this, and we want that suffering to be done and over with so that we can be back connected to joy, or connected to safety, or connected to whatever it is we're looking for, to get to the other side of that. For everybody, it's different. But it's that kind of wanting to rush through or just get that to go away. And it does make sense. So it's not making ourselves wrong for that reaction, but it's beginning to see that that's kind of, we can get caught up in a pattern where that becomes our patterned response to whatever happens. And so we're not here, we're not present for what's actually happening in our bodies, in our hearts, in our minds, as we go through whatever it is we're going through in our lives. We're too busy trying to manage it, trying to change it, trying to manipulate it, trying to fix it, rather than the last place we usually go to is here. And that's what the practice opens us to, the possibility of being here, of being present. Because when we come back here and we're connected to the power of compassion in the heart, when we're embodied and we're present with the suffering of others, that's where we can respond. And that's where we can be connected, and that's where we can make change. Does that make sense? Yeah. So this is a quote by Martin Luther King. I am convinced that love is the most durable power in the world. It is not an expression of impractical idealism, but of practical realism. Far from being the pious injunction of a utopian dreamer, love is an absolute necessity for the survival of our civilization. To return hate for hate does nothing but intensify the existence of evil in the universe. Someone must have sense enough and faith enough to cut off the chain of hate and evil, and this can only be done through love. So I'm going to share one more story from Pema Chodron. And this is from her book, Living Beautifully with Uncertainty and Change. Who knows Pema? So she's a I'm trying to think of how to describe her. She's quite a character. She's a Buddhist nun, and she's very down to earth. She curses. So she's not like this, she's this real, authentic person. So this is a story. She says, this is from the book, and it's the title of the chapter is The Catalyst for Compassion, which is what we're talking about today, right? Someone sent me a poem that seems to capture the essence of what she's calling the warrior commitment, empathy for other beings. Called Birdfoot's Grandpa, the poem is about a boy and his grandfather who was driving on a country road in a rainstorm. The grandfather keeps stopping the car and getting out to scoop up handfuls of toads that are all over the road and deposit them safely at the roadside. After the 24th time he's done this, the boy loses patience and tells his grandfather, "You can't save them all. Accept it. Get back in. We've got places to go." And the grandfather, knee-deep in wet grass, his hands full of toads, just smiles at his grandson and says, "They have places to go too." What a clear illustration of how this commitment works. The grandfather didn't mind stopping for the 24th time, didn't mind getting wet to save the toads. He also didn't mind the impatience of his grandson, because he was very clear in his mind that the frogs had as much desire to live as he did. So the aspiration to take care of all beings everywhere is huge. So we're talking about the Bodhisattva vow, right? That vow of that commitment to the awakening of all beings. And so she encourages us to start exactly where we are. Where we are right now is where we start. We're either closer to the grandson or closer to the grandfather, but wherever we are, that's where we start. And to me, that's the beauty of the practice. It's not about reaching some elevated state. It's about being with the messiness of life, not trying to get things to be perfect, not trying to live in a world where safety is a guarantee, because it isn't. Things, terrible things are going to happen. And how can we keep our hearts open when that happens? It's hard. And some of what makes it hard is the fury that gets triggered. We get overwhelmed. We feel powerless. We feel helpless. But even being with that's where we start. That feeling of powerlessness, feeling of helplessness. And that's where we call in the power of compassion, the power of the heart. And that's where we remember what I started off saying, that our common humanity, that all of us suffer, that our situations may be different, but what touches one person touches all of us. So we'll I'll take a break for questions if there are any questions. And again, I invite you to really be aware of what's coming up for you as you ask the question. Before we meditate. So anyone have any questions or comments?
Maybe just a comment about there was a session you did a couple of weeks ago, and you gave the analogy. I can't remember it now, but it ties into this so much when we're beginning the journey of being present. And you talked about the people in your around you in your bubble, and widening the circle and having compassion for everyone. But in the beginning, it's hard because it might, maybe it's like coming from a selfish standpoint, but like with the scenario of what just happened at the school, I mean, it's so unimaginable, and like it's too much, you know. So if you're trying to, I don't know, still kind of find your way from an individual, it's like it's really hard to open up to acknowledge that and have it just is so painful. Like it just is too much to even bring into for myself. This is what I'm finding. Like I'm just still focusing very kind of on a small scale. So I don't know if that's just that's kind of avoidance, or if it's actually part of the process.
Okay. So kind of feeling overwhelmed by what happened, and how do you open to that? Is that kind of your question? How can you even open to that? Like it's
right. Like if I'm still trying to kind of like find my way, and I don't know, it's so awful. That I don't know what I can do from like an individual standpoint.
You mean to actually help? Okay. So in talking about this practice, the first place we start is here, right? Meaning that awareness of what is being felt in our bodies, in our hearts, and we tend to that. So it's really important to be with whatever's arising within you. I mean, there's probably like a long list of practical things you could do to try and help, but that's not what we're here today to talk about. I mean, we can talk about that later on, but it's really about like how do we stay open to whatever is coming up for you in the moment. How do you meet that? And it's not that we get involved in a story about how we manage that. It's just, it could be simply breathing in and feeling the breath in your body, grounding yourself here. And then from that place of groundedness, then beginning to open to feeling compassion for others. Yes, there is a need. So I want to say this with a lot of honor and acknowledgement of the fact that there, on a practical basis, there have to be changes that are made, right? But I think changes can't happen unless there is some kind of wisdom present. Otherwise, it just comes out of directly out of fear. And then it gets colored by that. And the message isn't heard. And an example of that would be these kids that are speaking out. They're speaking out with a lot of wisdom. If you listen to what they're saying, it isn't, you know, they're not, they're asking for change. They're asking to be seen. They're asking to be heard. That's compassion. That's what I would say is compassionate resistance. Yes, James.
For me, the hardest thing to deal with is the thought that there is a movement toward opening the heart and toward light, but there's also a movement that's getting darker and darker, and it seems like these two processes are not affecting each other, and it almost feels like a game of karmic democracy. The ones with the most. I don't know how that's gonna.
So okay, yeah. So for you, that's the hardest part. Is seeing these two movements.
Seeing just how dark. You get into your own thing, but you just see how you're just surrounded by this darkness.
What's the commonality
Of the darkness?
Of the two, what's the commonality?
Human.
That's one, yeah. What else? Fear.
Okay.
That's why I said it starts here. It starts, with the acknowledgement of that, and where we go with when we have fear. When fear comes up, we go to a place of protection. Yes.
So there's the story of I think the story comes from Native American. His story being told, the grandfather was talking to his grandkid, his grandson, and he tells the grandkid, he goes, "Son, in the heart of every man, there lives two wolves, and they're constantly battling each other, trying to win." And the grandson goes, "Granddad, who wins?" And he goes, "The one you feed." So we can go back and let's grab him, let's torture him, let's kill him, let's cut him into little pieces. Who wins then? Hate with hate doesn't work. It is a bad thing that happened. Compassion doesn't mean that we accept that we're putting the other cheek, that we're being friendly, I guess. But it means that we have to start somewhere. We have to start with that fear that we have inside. Like when I was young, I used to mess around with ants. And when one bit me, kill it. That didn't take away my fear, my pain. The ant was dead. I crushed it, killed it. But still, the pain was there.
So if you look at the practice of compassion, it is even opening our hearts to what are termed difficult people. Talked about that on retreat, right? People that trigger us, people who've done horrendous things. Otherwise, we're reacting to life as if it's, or reacting to people as if they should be a certain way or shouldn't be. That gets us nowhere. Every person has a history and has been shaped by that history. And out of that history comes their actions. And when we react to somebody and just stick a label on them, we forget that. There's many, many different, I don't want to just, I'm not using this event because there's been this event, there's been many different events like this one. So it's really about how we respond to what's happening and how are we, each one of us, dealing with it, because it starts with us. If you think about it, the practice really starts with you, and when you make changes, it changes the way that you see life, the way that you interact with others. So then the way you touch somebody else's life is different. It's from that open place. Does that make sense? Yes, James.
And thinking about it more, you think about the Dalai Lama, you think about Thich Nhat Hanh, you think about all of these absolutely amazing souls, and they all were around a lot of suffering. Mm-hmm. And so it's that old, from suffering comes enlightenment. So maybe all of this darkness is really serving us. Yeah, and it's also, just as you said, that from that, maybe the darkness is serving us. It's also the acceptance that we are lightness and dark. Right. It isn't this, good and bad. Sometimes the fear is what makes us polarize, and categorize. But even in small ways, there's things that we've done that some of us, all of us, there's things we've done that we're not proud of. Nobody's perfect. So let's meditate. So we're actually going to do a compassion meditation. So sitting in a way where there's some alertness in the spine, wakefulness. So as you breathe, lengthening your spine. Maybe moving around a bit to find balance on the cushion. And imagine as you breathe in, the spine lengthening, the crown of the head moving up towards the ceiling, the chin slightly tucked towards the chest, and the shoulders relaxed. The hands resting lightly on the knees or in your lap. Feeling the ground beneath you, the points of contact between your body and the floor. And then taking full in-breath into the body, feeling the sensation of the breath as it travels into the body, the chest, the belly, expanding with the in-breath, and slowly breathing out, releasing with the out-breath. Allow your first 3 breaths to be deep and gentle, gently breathing in, a slow breath out, letting go with that out-breath.
Bringing all of your attention to the breath. Just allowing that breath to settle the mind, to settle the body. Softening the heart space. Taking some time to really arrive, to be here in this space. Acknowledging the presence of others around you. And we're all on this journey together. That all of us in some way suffer. We all feel joy. We all feel sorrow and sadness. And from a place of care and kindness for ourselves, for others, for the world, really cultivating their passion. So beginning to incline towards compassion, not trying to force it, but just setting an intention, creating space. So for sitting, knowing you're sitting, breathing, aware that you're breathing. Feeling your body, your heartbeat. And the life within you. Feeling how you treasure your own life. How you may guard yourself in the face of sorrows. And now bring to mind someone close to you whom you dearly love. Picture them perhaps sitting in front of you. And feel your natural caring for this person. Perhaps a person or a pet. Notice how you hold them in your heart. And then let yourself be aware of their measure of sorrows, their suffering in life. And feel how your heart opens to wish them well, to extend comfort, to share in their pain and meet it with compassion. This is a natural response of the heart. And as you incline your heart towards compassion, silently recite the following phrases to this person. May you be held in compassion. May your pain and sorrow be eased. May your heart be at peace. Continue reciting all the while you're holding them in your heart. You can modify these phrases any way that makes them true to your heart's intention. May you be held in compassion. May your pain and sorrow be eased. May your heart be at peace. And now imagine that they turn their compassionate gaze back to you and acknowledge the measure of sorrows you carry. They say to you with tenderness the same phrases. May you be held in compassion. May your pain and sorrow be eased. May you be at peace. Take in these compassionate wishes, allowing them to touch your heart. Noticing what arises as you repeat the phrases, making space for that, staying open. If at any point you get overwhelmed, focusing your attention on the breath as a place to safely rest the attention, grounding yourself. And then coming back to the phrases. This time directing the same compassion towards yourself. May I be held in compassion. May my pain and sorrow be eased. May I be at peace. Then beginning to widen that circle, extending compassion to those who are suffering right now. Whether it's loved ones, the families that are facing loss right now, the children, perhaps holding a collective image in your heart, aware of their difficulties and wishing them well with the same phrases. May you be held in compassion. May your pain and sorrow be eased. May you be at peace. And then widening the circle further to include all beings, neighbors, communities, difficult people, brotherhood and sisterhood of all beings everywhere. Sensing your tender-hearted connection with all of life and its creatures, and repeating the same phrases. May all beings be held in compassion. May all beings' pain and sorrow be eased. May all beings be at peace. Work with compassion practice intuitively, knowing that at times it may be difficult, as though we might be overwhelmed by the pain. Remember, we are not trying to fix the pain of the world, only to meet it with a compassionate heart. Be gentle, breathe. Let your breath and heart rest naturally as a center of compassion in the midst of the world. May the practice we've done here serve to awaken our hearts and minds, and that of all beings everywhere. Thank you. Thank you all for listening.